Welcome to this explainer. Picture this. It's the summer of 1940. The skies over southern England are just literally roaring with the engines of incoming bombers. Britain is under attack, facing what Winston Churchill warned would be a battle upon which the very freedom of the British people would depend. Now, in this terrifying crucible, one aircraft emerged, and it wasn't just a weapon of war. It became an enduring symbol of a nation's absolute will to survive. So today, we're going to break down the anatomy of what is, frankly, an absolute aviation masterpiece, the Supermarine Spitfire.
But to really understand this machine, we've got to look past the nuts and bolts. As one pilot famously put it, you don't fly a Spitfire, you just strap it on. I love that quote. It perfectly captures this visceral, almost emotional connection between the machine and the people who flew it. It was incredibly sensitive to the controls, absolutely beautiful to look at, and it responded so naturally it felt less like a vehicle and more like an extension of the pilot's own body.
Section 1. Birth of a Legend.
So, how did this legendary aircraft actually come to be? Well, we have to look at its brilliant yet tragically doomed creator, Reginald J. Mitchell. And Mitchell, he was in a desperate race against time. Back in 1931, your standard RAF biplanes were crawling along at barely 220 miles per hour. But Mitchell, he was busy designing racing seaplanes, winning the Schneider Trophy with a staggering speed of 340 miles per hour. Then, as Nazi Germany kicks off this massive rearmament program, the British Air Ministry suddenly really needs a fighter. Fast. So Mitchell evolved his racing concepts into what he called the Type 300 in late 1934. And by March 1936, the first prototype took flight, hitting 335 miles per hour. But there was this haunting urgency to all of his work, because the whole time, Mitchell was suffering from terminal cancer. Now, to hit those blazing speeds, Mitchell had to completely ditch the old wood and fabric biplane ideas. He went with this radical engineering technique called stressed skin construction. Basically, instead of building a heavy internal skeleton and just draping it in fabric, the external metal plating itself actually absorbed a lot of the structural stress. It's kind of like the shell of an egg. It's an incredibly clever way to get extreme durability and much higher speeds without adding a bunch of bulky weight to the airframe.
But Mitchell wasn't working in a vacuum. He brought together a team of absolute experts to build this thing out. You've got aerodynamicist Beverly Shinstone designing that iconic sweeping elliptical wing. You've got an enclosed cockpit, a retractable undercarriage, which were completely cutting-edge refinements at the time. They packed it with 8 forward-firing machine guns, and right at the heart of the whole shebang was a 12-cylinder, 1,000-horsepower, water-cooled power plant from Rolls-Royce. And that, of course, would soon become legendary as the Merlin engine.
But here's the really heartbreaking part. Reginald Mitchell wouldn't even live to see his masterpiece's finest hour. On June 11, 1937, he passed away. He was just 42 years old. His death obviously sent shockwaves through the design department, but his assistant, Joe Smith, stepped up as chief designer, and the team just kept pushing forward. The blueprints were finished, but, as we're about to see, designing a masterpiece and actually building thousands of them are two very, very different things.
Section 2. The race to produce.
Okay, so war is looking pretty much inevitable, and Britain needs thousands of fighters, fast. But out on the factory floor, there's a huge problem. You look at the Hawker Hurricane. It was based on older wood and fabric designs. It was sturdy, and most importantly, it was simple to build. The Spitfire, on the other hand, with its complex airframe and that gorgeous but highly difficult to manufacture elliptical wing, total manufacturing nightmare. It just did not lend itself to mass production and required a highly skilled workforce to put together. So even though the Spitfire was roughly 50 miles per hour faster, the RAF initially had to rely way more heavily on the Hurricane, simply because they could actually get those out the factory doors.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Battle of Britain Showdown.
Fast forward to September 1939, war breaks out. By June 1940, the Luftwaffe is staring right across the English Channel, and the ultimate heavyweight matchup of the year was set: the Spitfire versus the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Now, the math leading up to this was honestly terrifying. The Luftwaffe had 2,700 operational aircraft. The Royal Air Force, barely 650 operational fighters, and only about 230 of those were Spitfires. But once they actually got in the air, it was an incredibly tight match. The Spitfire was lighter, it had a tighter turning radius, and it packed those 8 machine guns. But the German pilots had some massive advantages. Their planes had fuel injection, and they carried 2 20mm cannons that fired explosive shells, which drastically outgunned the Spitfire.
So how on earth do you survive those odds? Well, the RAF needed a seriously brilliant divide-and-conquer strategy. Luckily,
Britain had the finest radar detection system in the world at the time. These radar stations would track incoming raids and vector the squadrons perfectly into position. They'd send the sturdy, stable Hurricanes in to just rip up the bomber formations. Meanwhile, the lightning-fast Spitfires were specifically tasked with a deadly high-altitude dance. Their job was to intercept and distract the swarms of those Bf-109 fighter escorts.
Section 4. Overcoming deadly flaws.
Because look, as gorgeous as the Spitfire was, actually dogfighting it over England revealed some terrifying mechanical realities. Remember how we just said the Messerschmitt had fuel injection? Well, the Spitfire's Merlin engine used a float-type carburetor. So if a Spitfire pilot simply pushed the nose down into a sudden steep dive to chase a German plane, the negative G-forces would starve the engine of fuel, and the engine would literally cut out. Imagine hitting the gas pedal on the highway and your engine just dies. No way, right? That was the terrifying reality for these pilots. And the German pilots knew this. They would just dive to escape. So British pilots had to invent this ingenious workaround on the fly. Step 1, they'd roll the plane into a sweeping left turn. Step 2, take the plane down smoothly to maintain positive G-force. And step 3, if they nailed it, they'd emerge right behind the diving enemy without losing an ounce of engine power.
And honestly, it gets worse. That float carburetor issue compounded into another massive problem: high-speed loss of control. See, early Spitfires had fabric-covered ailerons. Those are the flaps on the wings that control your roll. Well, at the extreme speeds of a steep dive, the air pressure would actually warp the fabric out of shape, causing pilots to completely lose steering control of the aircraft. Literally terrifying. It was a brutally steep learning curve up there, where a single mistake meant death.
Moving on to Section 5, Evolving the Masterpiece.
Despite all that, they survived. They won the Battle of Britain. But the war was far, far from over. As the Allied forces started pushing back into occupied France, German engineering wasn't exactly standing still. We see this rapid, deadly escalation in the skies. By 1941, to match the German firepower, the Spitfire Mark V enters service, finally adding those explosive 20mm cannons. But then, a terrifying new threat arrives: the German Focke-Wulf 190, famously known as the Butcher Bird. It was hitting nearly 400 miles per hour, and its maneuverability absolutely stunned British pilots. The engineers back at Supermarine had to scramble, and they delivered. By June 1942, they rolled out the Spitfire Mark IX, completely restoring the balance of power.
I mean, just look at that number, 410 miles per hour. That is the staggering top speed they squeezed out of the Mark IX. They even added power-assisted ailerons to match the Focke-Wulf's insane maneuverability. It is a huge testament to the raw potential of Mitchell's original airframe that engineers could just keep squeezing more and more power out of it year after year without breaking the core design.
Now, it wasn't perfect at everything. As the Allies pushed into Europe, they really needed planes for low-level ground attacks. The Spitfire, however, had a fatal flaw when it came to low altitudes. Its incredible Merlin engine relied on a liquid cooling system. That means if just one lucky bullet from a ground soldier pierced the front radiator, all the coolant would leak out, and that beautiful engine would seize up and die in about 4 minutes flat. Because of that, the Spitfire remained primarily a high-altitude fighter interceptor, and they left the gritty, dangerous ground attack roles to sturdier planes like the Typhoon.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, the ultimate aviation legacy. The true genius of this aircraft wasn't just how it started the war, right? It was how it finished it. The sheer scale of the Spitfire's adaptation is just mind-blowing. It was literally the only Allied fighter to stay in continuous production and service for the entire duration of the Second World War. Just look at these numbers for a second. By the end of the war, they had bolted on so many upgrades and weapons that the plane was a full third heavier. Yet thanks to constant engine advancements, it could climb 10,000 feet higher and fly 100 miles per hour faster than the original prototype. The base airframe was just that good.
To put its success into perspective, an unbelievable 22,500 Spitfires were built across all of its various marks and variants. It fought in every single theater of the war, from high-altitude photo reconnaissance missions all the way to carrier-borne naval operations. And get this, even as the world entered the jet age, the Spitfire remained in operational service with the RAF all the way until 1954.
You know, Reginald Mitchell used to say of his designs, "It looks good, it is good." And man, he was spot on. The Spitfire perfectly merged pure aesthetic grace with absolutely lethal combat effectiveness. It was a masterpiece of aerodynamics that commanded the genuine affection of the men who relied on it to keep them alive. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a question to chew on. How did a single machine become the ultimate symbol of a nation's will to survive? Perhaps it's because the Spitfire wasn't just a collection of metal and rivets. It was a brilliant idea born out of desperation, constantly evolving against all odds, and flown by brave individuals who willingly strapped it on when the world needed them most. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning how the masterpieces of our past continue to shape the world we live in today.